back to the Restart Pod. Um, there's a lot of discussion triggered by Alexander Karp, CEO of Palantir, this past few days that they're doing a deal with NVIDIA, like a fairly big one, that's provoked a lot of conversation, at least in my circles. The topic of which is AI sovereignty. This is the idea that right now, all of us, whether you're a consumer, whether you're running hot with Fable, whatever it is not the ideal state of the world. Like Karp is very like explicit in saying that like Anthropic and OpenAI are kind of running laps around the world in like a negative sense, like they're doing kind of damage almost. By kind of putting everyone on like a drug of token maxing, said the worst way possible. Where the argument he's making is that like every one of his like technical clients, all this sort of stuff, like they should ultimately own and be running their own model, at least for a lot of use cases. And so that has been something that's like just like been like an undercurrent for a number of months. I think especially as like people have been looking at their API spend. Like we've seen cases where the Coinbase CEO Brian Armstrong, they managed to cut the spend of their token class by a very significant margin, kind of diffusing their spend out, being more calculative as opposed to the trend of token maxing. That I think makes for a pretty large discussion point because Damon, historically, when you and I have talked about it, like the concern, at least like from the founder world, is like Anthropic eats everything, right? Like every single announcement, you just like eat whatever like opportunity, software, that sort of thing that you're building. Like it just becomes the responsibility of one general AGI. And my stance, I think, has always been a little bit more nuanced, maybe not solidified, but at least nuanced in the sense that like I think it makes a lot of sense to me that like in the hardest of use cases, we'll continue to see like you will use Fable, you will use Mythos for like you want to use the frontier for these use cases. But especially with the cost of these models and how much work has to happen in a company that like if you're going to make the bet that most of the AI spend in the world is going to go towards inference, um, I'm kind of the stance that like at a certain point we'll see the hyperscalers develop model routers that you pay for in the same way that you pay for like AWS load balancer or AWS gateway, um, and services within those things to diffuse whatever you're doing on Fable, Haiku, Sonnet down to some really cheap like trash model effectively. And we'll see like a very significant portion of inference go down to hardware software code design that then the hyperscalers distribute out. And the vast majority of interfaces then become something that maybe vanilla, maybe Claude inspired, and would see Anthropic push the frontier, but eventually get diffused out in most privatized settings. That was a lot of ramble. I apologize. That was really long, but your turn.
I think there's lots of ways to comment on this, and I'll just kind of go in parts. The first thing that occurs to me whenever somebody like Alex is delivering this point, there's a paradox that he doesn't wrestle with, which I'd like to outline and talk through. But also, the question in my mind is always: is this self-serving?
Yeah.
And if so, how much faith can I put in the accuracy of it? To be very clear, sometimes it can be both accurate and self-serving. Most of the best things usually are. So like just because it's self-serving doesn't mean it's disqualifying on its face. But like the first thing to say is who wins in the world in which Alex is proposing, and the reality is Palantir does. And so like there is some version of self-serving there that I think just needs to be stated and reflected upon in this discussion. I also think the paradox it doesn't wrestle with is what he's kind of arguing for without saying it is that people shouldn't be using Palantir either. Because in order for it to be truly sovereign, that means going away from them as well. So it's a bit odd to me that he's simultaneously arguing that like don't hand over your processes to Anthropic, but do hand them over to Palantir,
who uses Anthropic. For the record, like my investment in the argument is not of like Palantir's position, but just like the general statement about like where does the model running end up happening and who owns that sort of thing.
Yep, totally understood. I'm more or less table setting for the audience, not as a rebuttal to your comments. I'll get to your comments directly in a moment. But all I'm saying is his comments are number one, self-serving. Number two, I think accurate. But then number three, don't kind of wrestle with the paradox that is if you're going with Anthropic or Palantir, that decision doesn't actually branch at the inflection point he's kind of triggering. So
Right.
again, just kind of saying that up front. I think the other important thing to note on that you said is I tend to agree with you in that the hyperscalers and the cloud providers actually make the most natural articulation point for this routing behavior
Yep.
that we're kind of choosing. So like I don't really want to manage my own cluster because those have costs, both in terms of buying the racks themselves, managing the
Yeah.
electricity, managing a depreciation schedule, swapping in and out the models, making sure the models play well with the GPUs and the CPUs and the whatever TPUs,
Yeah.
XPUs that come next that run inference. Like people don't want to do that. Like there's a reason that
Right.
we migrated to the cloud in the first place,
Yeah.
right?
There's no reason a pharma company should care about what's happening on the data rack.
No, sovereignty is a
Yep.
different issue, right? Absolutely,
Yep.
we need to worry about sovereignty and how we're
Yep.
managing our intelligence and our proprietary, alpha, as Alex called. All of those things, I think, are good points that we can talk through in stages. But to be clear, I don't think what you're going to have is mass migration of the enterprise to self-hosted racks. I don't think you're doing that. I don't think you're having self-hosted models. I do think you're going to get smart model routing, but I still think that lives at an abstraction layer. And I actually
Hmm.
think people use this word of data sovereignty, model sovereignty, open weights, owning your weights, yada, yada. I think what people actually are responding to is the idea of provider lock in. People don't want to be reliant on Anthropic or on OpenAI or insert other company here for their most valuable business asset, which is
Hmm.
fundamentally their intelligence. And
Right.
so I think that's what the public response has largely been and why you're seeing gravity towards open source. Right now, it's not because anybody's actually making a logical argument that open source is better. It's that people are, I think, emotionally reacting correctly so, in my opinion, to the almost fear response. That is, oh my goodness, I can now see for the first time a realistic path to Anthropic owning a critical mass of the things that I do. And now they're not just
Right.
coming to eat startups, they might be coming to eat me as well.
Yeah,
And how
like
do I not, how
mid-sized
do I prevent that?
businesses or whatever it is. Yeah. I mean, I think the nuance to color in there, in my view, is that like the fear-based response of like, hey, like Claude is like I think a Claude tag really a lot in a lot of the dialogues I'm a part of, like Claude tag ends up being like a very spooky thing. Not for the stars, but that like Claude is making more traversals across the context layer of a business. And not to say that that's what Slack is, but we see a number of companies that try to make these like Slack bots. What they're trying to do is they're trying to like capture the context layer in some shape. Um, and it just kind of makes sense that Claude's building your Slack bot that you then kind of give your MCP integrations, you have all this other stuff connected, whatever, and then those traces are being handed to Claude to train off of whatever it may be, right? Um, as you kind of said, like I don't think most companies have an interest in running their own rack. Like that obviously doesn't make sense for 99% of people. I think what we'll end up seeing is that like there'll be these like primo architectures, like the sort of like not run of the mill, but like the standard architecture that like AWS, GCP, Azure, they're aware of. And when you are taking like whatever Soda Kimi is and whatever Soda Fable is, and you're using Fable for your best use cases, like Anthropic has a large percentage owned by AWS. Like there might be some partnership or license there about like drag your Fable use over to Kimi. That's a service that AWS provides. And in that universe, the place that the value aggregates ends up being the hyperscaler's surface in the long term, or just whoever owns the data center effectively.
Mhm.
Um, which I don't know what that means for Anthropic in the longer horizon. If the tone continues this way, like there's some argument that like I think in the anti-Karp, anti-NVIDIA case, like there's some like people keep on make this reference like the bitter lesson of things. And like I think in some cases like there is some potential like not low probability, like fairly median probability of like we just watch these like frontier labs become new age hyperscalers and they get to own context and that's just something that is the state of the world.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm less I think right now the tone combined with the whole governmental elements that are playing into um, AI sovereignty, I suppose, and concerns over model runtime is going to push more value to hyperscalers accidentally, if that makes sense.
I do think, for the record, hyperscalers win, and we can talk about who the
Mhm.
hyperscalers are and what winning means. But I do think you've laid it out in the way that I feel is most probable going
Mhm.
forward. And I think it's exactly the inspiration for what's driving the massive amount of capex spend from those folks. And
Yep.
you've seen call it minor pivot from XAI. We've seen now SpaceX. We've
Right.
seen Meta do the same thing. Amazon, Google, um, Microsoft with Azure, as you mentioned, they're already there.
Yeah.
And Anthropic and OpenAI are both working in that direction down the
Mhm.
stack. Right now, they're just trying to find their footing, in my opinion, about what parts of it they need to own. Do they actually want to own the data centers, which they're already both playing in, right? With
Yeah.
the Project Stargate as a notable
Yeah.
example from OpenAI, right? They were there kind of first, looks pretty prescient now,
Mhm.
but Anthropic is catching up pretty quickly, and they're also stepping into making their own chips,
Yep.
which they'll be able to own distribution of, put them in their own data centers if they so choose. And so I agree with you. I think that the marketplace effect of the AWSs of the world, where it's like, run your processes here, run your compute clusters here. Don't worry about model routing. We'll do the cost optimization for you. You can self-select some tasks to go to dedicated models if you want to, or if you want
Mhm.
to have some tasks reserved for Fable only or whatever the state of the art is, you can. But for everything else, for your emails and for your stuff that really doesn't matter all that much, or just kind of the usual cadence of day-to-day business, you can route those to the most efficient models. And again, I think the service that fundamentally the hyperscalers will provide is less provider lock-in. Now, of course, you're still going to get lock-in at that layer, but at least at that layer, that's not your intelligence layer. And I think that's going to feel better to people. Functionally, it's the same, but I think it's going to
Yeah.
feel better to people.
Yeah, what's interesting is that in this potential pitch, like directionally what ends up happening is that instead of like quote unquote AGI being a thing, like we might have a model that is quote like generally AGI. Some people would say we're already there, like we've been there with Fable and Mythos or whatever it is. What you end up having is hopefully, I guess, in this like idealized world that is like Karp, NVIDIA, eventually the old school hyperscalers, like idealized future is one that like we have privatized ASI rather than a general AGI that like every company has like their subset of like here's our context. The only real moat left is basically just like the customer trust that you have, like whoever your clients are and the relationships you have with them. And everything else is like how much runtime can you bring into automation effectively? And it's like whatever you can diffuse into your cloud provider effectively that decides that. And how much does AWS care to capture that in something that's generic? Probably not that much. But it's not hard to imagine that like there might be, let's say there's like 17 pharma companies. Like I would not be surprised if AWS begins serving like in the same way Bedrock serves Fable, whatever. There might be like a Kimi based science with the option to fine tune on your wet lab or something similar that you can then drag over.
Yeah, I'm having a really hard time at present trying to wrap my head around how much of the total business value of the world
Mhm.
Anthropic and others eat. I
Yeah.
just instinctively, like, I have a very hard time updating priors and kind of changing my internal bias that basically says there is no way that Anthropic eats everything. Just that just feels impossible to me.
Mhm.
But all the data kind of is telling me the opposite. And so I'm just really having a hard time squaring those things. And to be very clear, I don't think Anthropic eats everything. I just think it's
Right.
fundamentally next to impossible for that to happen. But I think en masse, people generically, not any individuals specifically, but generically, people still undervalue the true um, benefit or
Mhm.
leverage that the greatest intelligence provides you.
Right.
Like, the analogy that I would use, and I would encourage the listeners to digest, imagine that we're in any competitive endeavor. Imagine you're a competitive swimmer or a competitive race car driver or a competitive track athlete or something like that. And imagine for a minute that you were able to drive with the fastest car or run using the best pair of shoes, or you were forced or chose to, out of your own uh, decision making, to do second best in either one of those paths, you're not going to win the race very
Mm,
often, right? The person with the fastest car is going to win the race most of the time. Not every time, but most of the time. I think people are far underweighting the value of the metaphorical fastest car for most business processes, right? For finance or for health or for law or for any industry in which you can actually differentiate by service, meaning the service you can provide is better than
mhm.
your competitors in on some vector. Those industries are going to have to, you know, in the metaphor, build the fastest race car. And you're not going to
Sure.
opt for second best in those competitive industries. And so the open question in my mind is what is the economic value of those quote unquote competitive industries and how many industries can settle for second best? I don't know the answer to that,
Right.
but it feels very much to me like all the economic value is going to accrue to the ones that don't settle for second best.
Yeah, I mean the well, so there's some places where there is a counter argument. The places that there aren't is like hedge funds, right? Like there's no reason for a hedge fund if everyone's like fighting over like pico units,
Mhm.
of like difference that like you would downgrade your model for whatever case. Um, Ultimately, the vast majority of businesses have like a CFO is the problem. And with a CFO, like everything you're doing has a CAGS, that like
Of course.
there's some appreciable level of like you can deprecate the like cost of running your business or services for some marginal loss that like your clients may not notice. It's the same thing as like in the entrepreneurial world, right? Like you can build 70 things, but if only like one or two of them really matter, you
Mhm.
just focus on doing those really well and you turn down the cost levers on those other 68 things, then you're in a better position net, right? Um, the place that I look at as like potentially different in this sort of like worldview, I think is in like a go forward, like in a way that like I guess to answer the question of like how does Anthropic win everything, I think the thing that's happening that's somewhat novel is that the hyperscalers have never really owned interface. Like Google as a hyperscaler owns a lot of interface, but they don't own like productive surface, if that makes sense, right? Like Microsoft owns a lot of productive surface, but they're not like behaving like a hyperscaler in the true sense of like pushing their own models. That's a new thing. Maybe they're trying to go that way. The one thing that is kind of happening, I think, is that just by virtue of like how Anthropic is just blitzing the market, like in a literal marketing sense, like how much public repute that they've built up over time. There is a possibility that like again, not likely, but like double digit percentage chance to me that what ends up happening is that you have enough small and medium sized businesses that are not mature enough to have an engineering org that you would be on an AWS or a GCP or an Azure. And what ends up happening is you see these smaller, medium sized businesses don't have an engineering team, but they do have a brand team, a go to market team. They have accounting, they have finance, whatever. And these people begin to bridge technical by courtesy of like a Claude coworker or otherwise that provides Claude enough like fuselage effectively to begin becoming invisibly a hyperscaler, right? They become a cloud provider and there's enough bleed up and bleed out of skill that right now, people on their resumes have AWS. They have AWS Kubernetes. They have AWS Lambda. If at some point we reach a stage that like your marketing person has like Claude Cowork, like Fable content or something, like the content production side of using Fable or Mythos for whatever, that might be a marketable skill that all of a sudden future orgs are looking for. We're going to choose to be a Claude house, or an Anthropic house that all of our models are built off of Claude derivatives. They're built off of like Claude runtime, like browser use, the router or whatever that's in the system, which Fable now has. There's a router that'll bump you down to Opus 4.8. All that sort of stuff will be baked into the hyperscaler productive surface, which right now is Cowork. In the future, could just be like whatever your agent management swarm interface is that runs your like 550 million ARR company or higher kind of thing.
Mhm, mhm. Two comments, kind of unrelated, but just on your point of like the hedge funds obviously opting for the most intelligent thing. I think the filter that each person can run for themselves and trying to deduce how many of these industries matter is how many services are you comfortable not having the best thing in, and how
Yeah.
much on net do you pay for those, contrasted with how many services do you absolutely want to opt for the best thing. Like I'm thinking about your mother's sick. How important is that diagnosis to you? Pretty important, right? Like, I don't want the second best cancer doctor. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's not something that I'm opting for, especially in a world when the best is available to everybody. In a world when the best isn't available to everybody, sure, you have to. But when I'm sending my email, don't care as much, right? But then the question becomes how many dollars accrue to the cancer doctor versus the email client, right? That seems fairly intuitive to me. So then the second order question is just how many of those cancer doctor examples are there? Like we hedge funds, self-driving cars. I'm not getting the second safest self-driving car, right? I'm not buying the second best
I mean,
security.
playing counter to that, like in the modern day, like self-driving cars are like approaching an SF, like not commodity, but people
Mhm.
will use both Waymos and robo taxis, and they have their cost justifications for why people go one way or the other. But to
Mhm.
some people, like I don't think that they're aware of there even being a difference in quality. It's just like a vibe feel sort of thing, and that's fine, right?
Yeah, it's a perfectly valid counter
Yeah.
because even right now, people don't make their car buying decision based on just like which one gets the
Hmm.
highest safety ratings, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
for folks that are going to opt for second safest car, that might be good enough. And again,
Yeah.
that's why I'm encouraging the self selection. If people
Right.
opt for second rate medical care all the time, again, it's not going to
No.
be everybody. I think that's right. But then secondly, to your point, on kind of the adoption and how Anthropic kind of eats everything or close to everything. It's exactly as you're saying. If you subscribe even some chance to the idea of recursive self improvement, then whoever gets there first has a compounding first mover advantage in all of those fronts. Meaning, if you
Right.
do get marketers using Claude Cowork in any respect, then the data that Anthropic can collect on those workflows to build the next workflow, matched with having the best coding agent to build that kind of next
Hmm.
iteration of harness, you can pretty quickly envision how they kind of run away with the
Right.
field. And again, I'm not saying that's most likely. I'm just saying if let me say it as simply as I can say it. If you started with the conclusion that Anthropic won everything, and you worked backwards from that conclusion, itemizing the steps in which it would have to happen in order for them to get there, they are starting to knock down some of those
Yeah.
checkboxes.
Yeah. The interesting thought that's in my head, just like even just like talking about this right now, is like we keep talking about like the SaaS apocalypse, whatever, and there's like a stray thought that's in my head about just like I think the only software companies left that have longevity in like a true sense are ones that posture as frontier labs. I don't know if that's a consensus opinion. Maybe it is. Like I don't know how like common that is as a thought, but like if you're going to make a software company, it better be oriented to be a frontier lab that your target is recursively self-improve on something, that otherwise you're like you don't have a chance to like win out in like this hyperscaler like bloody ocean that is happening right now, both between like the neo companies like neo I whatever you want to bucket the Anthropic OpenAIs of the world as, and like the old legacy dinosaurs of AWS, whatever. um like unless you're going to attempt to capture context and knock down those same like checkboxes that you refer to, like you're just not competitive in pure software. And it's not unreasonable to assume that you might be eventually contending in like the hardware that runs your stuff eventually or something or another.
Yeah, for me, I think the case study to watch play out there is Salesforce, right?
Yeah.
Salesforce is kind of the system of record forever. I think it's unlikely that what you see is mass migration away from Salesforce, but instead, what I actually think you see is far fewer companies beginning to adopt Salesforce in the first place.
As a starting point.
Right.
Yeah.
They're just like, we're going with Anthropic. To your point, like if
Yeah.
I'm a startup and I'm 10 people right now, zero chance of my ever signing up for Salesforce. It's
Hmm.
expensive. I don't really need it. I don't really care. My data can now live everywhere. I need one abstraction layer on top of it so I can query it with an LLM, right? My choice of LLM, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm just not signing up for it. And so like they probably do have some timeline where they can survive and maybe they pivot long enough to survive into whatever the kind of next evolution of Salesforce needs to be, Agent Force, as I've called it, whatever that becomes.
Yeah.
But it's just very hard for me to see why a new customer would sign up for anything that isn't Anthropic right now, but
Right.
also could be OpenAI or like some other Neo Lab or something in the future.
Yeah. Like it's fascinating to me to watch I think the tone of like there's a whole universe of people which are like they're aiming for their own like personal sovereignty on their own devices or whatever. Like, I don't think that ends up being anything meaningful aside from maybe just like a training exercise about like edge or something generally. Um, but what ends up the one thing that like I don't see anyone having a counter opinion to is like where AWS, that's a given. Where GCP, that's a given. Where Azure, that's a given. And like there's no reason to cast a shadow over that part of the technology stack of your company, regardless of who you are. Like even these companies that don't have engineering teams might have like one CIO and they're like, yeah, for running stuff we have Azure if we need to. But otherwise, like we can go get an OpenAI agreement. Otherwise, we can go get an Anthropic agreement. Just if we need to add something that can go into our Azure slash GCP slash whatever it is. And that universe, you end up, bringing at least some of the value, which I think like the open routers of the world, some of the like OpenClaw, Hermes conversation just gets dragged into those environments, whatever consensus ends up being.
Yeah, I would, to be convinced otherwise to what you just said, I would need someone to rationally make the argument to me why, in a world in which you've already made the transition to cloud, we would revert that trend. I just
Right.
haven't found that argument compelling in the slightest. Like
Right.
all these same frustrations and concerns and risks that people are outlining right now for AI were the same risks of sovereignty concerns of like handing over your clusters to AWS or
Right.
Google when it happened. It was like, wait, I need on-prem services. Turns out, really,
Right.
you don't. Right? There's like very
Right.
few services actually need to be on-prem. You can privatize a cloud cluster. You can do all these kind of things that really aren't any more or less safe. And honestly, I would argue less. Like I'm far more confident in Google's ability to protect me from cyber attacks than I am from my own,
Yeah.
my own racking, like in my closet or whatever.
Yeah. You don't want these YC 22-year-old like vibe coders setting up their pharma data
No,
rack.
no,
um,
yeah,
there,
which
there,
is
yeah, there is some. I mean, like the one thing I will add color to, I think, like as just a nuance, maybe just kind of like wrap out the conversation there. Like as someone who loves conceptually edge, like you and I like talk about like what markets actually end up being gigantic, or at least you made a comment about it yesterday. Like, um, I think all thoughtful inference ends up cloud naturally, but like right now there is I think one novel thing that is like we'll still have cloud in some circumstances. Like there will be robots in the world, there will be drones in the world, there will be satellites in the world. Like it makes sense to me that there might be some like intermediary, like what's the word, lighthouse, almost like something that's connected to work primarily happening in the cloud, but gets the benefit of like terraria, like earthly connectivity, but then is able to speak to things that are on the edge that like that might end up being like a pretty small like micro data center somewhere, like something that's able to do meaningful processing. But its value is in like teleporting that communication out to like a swarm of things out there in the world, whether it's your like robotic wet lab or like your like drone swarm fighting a war somewhere, that sort of thing. That going direct to cloud seems like it's fundamentally like weak in some shape, like it's brittle, like it's very subject to weak arguments.
agreed. Two points. Number one, the conversation of edge, I think, perfectly applies to adversarial environments where you
Yep.
can't get information back to the cloud. Therefore, you have to do it on edge. But I actually think
Yep.
that becomes the default backup because I think the
Hmm.
world that we're headed towards is a world in which we have satellite connectivity that is near ubiquitous. So you can use that, satellite as the lighthouse in
Yep.
your example to run all of your inference in the default case, but then have edge inference, on device inference, to be clear, when necessary in the event
Right.
that that signal is jammed. I'm thinking mostly towards like defense, disaster
Right.
relief kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah. There's interesting. I mean, like, I don't. There's an element of like the kind of like corporate dominance of space. Like satellite, of course, in this case can mean a lot of things. Like satellite could mean like a literal one in space, but there's like satellite data centers on like Earth. Like just the idea of like a remote proxy to the cloud, whatever it is.
Correct.
Um, like in those environments, like that's not like SpaceX obviously dominates with Starlink, and like they have the domain expertise and literal control of that environment in like a very literal sense. But it's interesting to that like that's a beginning conversation. There's a lot of ways that can shape out that hasn't played out in like a real way, and I don't think any of the hyperscalers have taken like a serious interest in that yet, which is curious. Like I don't have a conclusive statement in that. I'm just kind of like putting an asterisk on it as like a note to self and to audience as like that's an unestablished thought that I think is worth pondering more. Anyway, interesting chat. More will be more. We'll catch y'all tomorrow. I guess we'll do a longer episode since it's Friday. And then happy 4th of July, American dynamism or whatever, A16Z fireworks. I don't know. We'll catch y'all later. Bye.